What if the person who promised you forever rejected you for something you couldn't change? If you've ever been told you take up too much space, this story is for you. And trust me, what happens next will melt even the coldest heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The westbound Pacific Express thundered to a halt in the rain-soaked town of Timberline, Washington. Steam billowed into the crisp autumn air as passengers disembarked onto the weathered platform, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. Among them stood Rebecca Harlow, clutching her well-worn leather suitcase with white knuckles, her 6'2" frame towering above the other travelers. Rebecca adjusted her navy traveling dress and took a steadying breath. The town sprawled before her, a collection of wooden buildings with smoke curling from stone chimneys, nestled among towering pines that seemed to touch the clouds. This remote logging settlement was to be her new home, a fresh start far from the whispers and stares of Philadelphia society. She'd never fit in back east, too tall, too bookish, too opinionated. The words had followed her like shadows. By 28, she'd resigned herself to spinsterhood until a newspaper advertisement caught her eye. Timber merchant seeks educated, practical wife. Correspondence encouraged. For 8 months, she and Thomas Whitaker had exchanged letters. His penmanship was neat, his words thoughtful. He described a thriving lumber business, a handsome house on a hill, and dreams of a family. Not once had he asked about her appearance. Not once had she mentioned her height. Their letters discussed literature, business matters, and shared hopes for the future. It felt genuine. It had felt like a possibility. Rebecca searched the platform. For her intended, the last letter from Thomas tucked carefully in her coat pocket. Her heart quickened as a man in a tailored brown suit approached, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "Miss Harlow?" he inquired, his gaze meeting hers before traveling downward, then up again, a lengthy journey she knew all too well. "Mr. Whitaker," she replied, extending her gloved hand with the practiced grace her mother had instilled in her. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Thomas Whitaker was handsome in a conventional way, clean-shaven with perfectly combed hair and sharp features, but he barely reached her shoulders, and his handshake was quick, dismissive almost, as he took an instinctive step backward. "You didn't mention your considerable stature in your letters," he said, his voice tight. Rebecca kept her expression neutral, though something cold settled in her stomach. "You never asked." "A woman should compliment her husband, not overshadow him," Thomas said, his words carefully measured, but laced with unmistakable disappointment. "I run a respectable business. Appearances matter in Timberline." "I see," Rebecca replied, aware of onlookers at the station watching their exchange with undisguised interest. "And what do you propose we do now? I've traveled over 2,000 miles at your invitation." Thomas cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the curious townspeople gathering nearby. "The eastbound train returns tomorrow morning. I'll arrange accommodations for tonight at the boarding house and purchase your return ticket." He reached for her suitcase. "Allow me to—" "I can carry my own bag," Rebecca interrupted, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "I've been managing just fine for 28 years. She lifted her chin slightly, refusing to shrink under his gaze or the whispers that had already begun around them. A group of loggers near the station door made no effort to hide their amusement, one even offering a low whistle. "Mighty big woman for such a little man," someone muttered, followed by poorly suppressed laughter. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'll escort you to Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. It's the least I can do." The walk through Timberline's muddy main street was interminable. Rebecca felt the weight of every state and heard the whispers that followed in their wake. The town wasn't so different from others she'd seen. General store, post office, church, saloon, but she'd never felt more foreign. More conspicuous, Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house stood at the edge of town, a 3-story Victorian with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. Thomas spoke briefly with the proprietress, an elderly woman with sharp eyes who looked Rebecca up and down without bothering to hide her assessment. "Room at the top of the stairs," Mrs. Fletcher said, pocketing Thomas's coins. "Supper's at 6, not a minute later." Thomas turned to Rebecca, hat in hand. "I truly am sorry, Miss Harlow. I simply need a wife who fits the position." "You mean someone smaller?" Rebecca said plainly. "Someone invisible." He didn't deny it. "The stage for Portland leaves at 8 tomorrow. From there you can catch the eastbound train." He hesitated, before adding, "Your ticket will be waiting at the station office." And with that he was gone, leaving Rebecca standing in the narrow foyer with her suitcase and wounded pride. Her room was sparse but clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, a small window overlooking the dense forest that surrounded Timberline. Rebecca sat on the edge of the mattress, removed her hat, and finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Not tears. She'd long since learned that tears solved nothing, but a deep, shuddering breath that carried the weight of another rejection. She'd spent her life being too much, too tall for dancing partners, too educated for suitable conversation, too imposing for delicate parlor gatherings, and now, apparently, too tall to be a proper wife in a timber town. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Fletcher entered without waiting for a response, carrying a tray with tea and a sandwich. "Thought you might be hungry after your journey," the older woman said, her voice gentler than before, "and perhaps in need of a company that isn't making a fool of itself." Rebecca managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher." "Call me Mildred," she replied, setting down the tray. "Been running this place for 30 years, seen all kinds come and go." She surveyed Rebecca with frank curiosity. "Thomas Whitaker's a fool, but you'll learn that most men are, in one way or another." Rebecca sipped the tea, strong and sweet, just what she needed. "I should have been more forthcoming in my letters." "Nonsense," Mildred scoffed. "If that man was worth his salt, he'd see past a little thing like height." 6 foot 2 inches is hardly little," Rebecca said, with a wry smile. "In my experience, it's not the size that matters, but what you do with the space you occupy," Mildred replied. "Now eat your sandwich. Nothing improves with an empty stomach." After Mildred left, Rebecca unpacked the few items she'd need for the night: her nightgown, hairbrush, and book. Tomorrow she would begin the long journey back east, back to the life she'd been so desperate to escape. What would she tell her family, her friends? The truth would only confirm what they'd always believed, that she was destined to remain alone, too awkward and imposing for marriage. Evening settled over Timberline, the sky darkening to deep purple. Rebecca changed for supper, smoothing her hands over her forest green dress. It was one of her finest, made by her own hands, with careful attention to the lines that best suited her frame. She'd planned to wear it for her first dinner with Thomas. Instead, it would be her first and last meal in a town that had already rejected her. The boarding house dining room held a mix of permanent residents and travelers. Conversation stilled briefly as Rebecca entered, then resumed with the undercurrent of curiosity she'd grown accustomed to over the years. She took her assigned seat at the far end of the table, nodding politely to her dining companions. "Passing through?" asked the gentleman to her right, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a well-trimmed beard. "Yes," Rebecca replied simply. "Just for the night." "Shame," he said, offering the breadbasket. "Timberline grows on you. I came for a month's work 3 years ago and somehow never left." Across the table, a young woman with bright copper hair leaned forward. "You're the one who came to marry Thomas Whitaker, aren't you? The whole town's talking about it." Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. "News travels fast." "Small towns," the woman shrugged. I'm Harriet Preston, the schoolteacher, and you're not missing much with Thomas. He measures his fence posts twice, but his own character is not at all." A few chuckles rippled around the table, easing some of the tension in Rebecca's shoulders. The conversation shifted to local matters, the coming winter, timber prices, a new baby born at the Jenkins farm. For a brief moment, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine belonging to this community, finding her place among these straightforward people. After dinner, restless and unwilling to be confined to her small room, Rebecca decided to walk. The night air was crisp, scented with pine and wood smoke. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and followed a narrow path that led toward the edge of town, where forest met civilization. The trees here were magnificent, towering Douglas firs and cedars that made even her feel small by comparison. In their presence, her height seemed inconsequential, just another variation in a world of infinite differences. She found a fallen log at the forest's edge and sat, watching as lanterns were lit across town, small beacons of warmth. In the gathering darkness, "Don't often find folks out here this time of evening," a deep voice rumbled from behind her. Rebecca startled, turning to find a man emerging from the shadows of the trees. He was enormous, at least 6'6", with broad shoulders and a thick beard that couldn't hide the strong line of his jaw. His flannel shirt was rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. Despite his imposing size, there was something gentle in his stance, careful not to frighten her. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "Jackson Reed. I run the Northern Timber Operation." For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Rebecca had to look up to meet someone's eyes. "Rebecca Harlow," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "The woman Thomas Whitaker brought in on today's train," he nodded. "It wasn't a question. News certainly travels quickly here." "Small town," he shrugged, the gesture reminiscent of Harriet at dinner. "Mind if I join you? These woods are my thinking." "Spot 2, Rebecca nodded, shifting slightly on the log to make room. Jackson sat with a comfortable distance between them, stretching out long legs, encased in worn denim. "Is it true you're leaving tomorrow?" he asked after a moment of companionable silence. "Yes," Rebecca sighed. "It seems I'm not what Mr. Whitaker had in mind for a wife." Jackson snorted, the sound surprisingly elegant in its disdain. "Thomas Whitaker wouldn't know a treasure if it fell on his head from one of my trees." Rebecca couldn't help but smile at the blunt assessment. "You're not friends, I take it?" "We have differences of opinion," Jackson said diplomatically, "about business, about character, about what matters in this life." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds of the forest, an owl's distant call, the rustle of wind through evergreen branches. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This is my favorite time in the woods," Jackson said finally. "When the day workers have gone home, it's just the trees and whoever's brave enough to sit with them." "They're magnificent," Rebecca agreed. "I've never seen anything like them." "Most folks here see board feet and profit margins. I see," he paused, searching for words, "I see history, strength, beauty that doesn't apologize for taking up space." Something in his tone made Rebecca turn to study his profile, strong and thoughtful, in the fading light. "That's a rare perspective for a man who cuts them down." "I harvest them," he corrected gently, "selectively, sustainably. My crews take what we need no more. We plant 2 saplings for every tree." He glanced at her with unexpected humor in his eyes. "Makes me unpopular with men like Whitaker, who want to clear-cut entire mountainsides for quick profit." Rebecca found herself warming to this giant of a man with his respectful approach to the forest. "Where I come from, people don't think much about where their lumber comes from." "Most don't," Jackson agreed, "but everything has a story. These trees, this town. He looked at her directly. "You?" Rebecca felt a curious warmth spread through her chest. "My story isn't particularly interesting." "I doubt that very much, Miss Harlow." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She'd grown so accustomed to dismissal that genuine interest felt almost foreign. "It's getting late," Jackson said, rising to his feet. "May I walk you back to town? These paths can be tricky in the dark." Rebecca nodded, accepting his offered hand to help her up. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, strong but unfailingly gentle. As they walked side by side through the deepening twilight, Rebecca experienced a novel sensation. She felt perfectly proportioned, neither too tall nor too imposing, simply right. Back at the boarding house, Jackson paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "What time is your stage tomorrow?" 8 o'clock, Rebecca replied, suddenly reluctant to say goodbye to this unexpected acquaintance. Jackson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Would you allow me to see you off in the morning, perhaps provide a proper farewell to Timberline?" "I'd like that," Rebecca said, surprising herself with the admission. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Harlow." He tipped his hat, a surprisingly elegant gesture from such a rugged man. "Sleep well." Rebecca watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness of Timberline's main street. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt a twinge of regret at the thought of leaving. In her room, as she prepared for bed, Rebecca found herself wondering about Jackson Reed and his northern timber operation. There was something compelling about a man who spoke of trees with reverence, who moved through the world with such easy confidence in his own skin, a man who made her feel for one brief evening as though her height was not a flaw, but simply a fact no more remarkable than the color of her eyes or the sound of her voice. But tomorrow she would board the stage for Portland, and then the long train back east. Whatever might have been explored between them would remain just that, a possibility, unrealized. Rebecca extinguished the lamp and lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling. Around her, tomorrow would bring another journey, another beginning, or perhaps an ending. She wasn't quite sure which. Dawn arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight filtering through the thin curtains of Rebecca's boarding house room. She'd slept surprisingly well, despite the unfamiliar bed and the uncertainty of her situation. Perhaps it was the mountain air, or perhaps the unexpected encounter with Jackson Reed had calmed something restless within her. Rebecca dressed with care, choosing a practical traveling ensemble in deep burgundy, a color her mother always said brought warmth to her fair complexion. As she pinned her honey-blonde hair into a simple chignon, she wondered what awaited her back in Philadelphia. The same whispers, the same pitying glances from former schoolmates, now married with children, the same careful arrangements at social gatherings to ensure she wasn't paired with shorter gentlemen for dinner. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Breakfast is served," called Mildred Fletcher's voice, "and you have a visitor downstairs." Rebecca's heart quickened. Jackson had mentioned seeing her off, but she hadn't expected him so early. She gathered her small traveling bag and made her way downstairs, surprised to find not Jackson, but Thomas Whitaker standing stiffly in the foyer, hat in hand. "Miss Harlow," he said with a formal nod, "I've come to escort you to the station and ensure your departure arrangements are satisfactory." Rebecca kept her expression neutral. "That's quite unnecessary, Mr. Whitaker. I'm perfectly capable of finding the stage office." "Nevertheless," he insisted, "it's the proper thing to do. Proper." The word echoed hollowly. There was nothing proper about inviting a woman across the country only to reject her on sight. But Rebecca had long since learned that arguing with men like Thomas was an exercise in futility. "Very well," she conceded. "I'll just have some breakfast first." The dining room was half full, mostly men preparing for a day's work in the forests or mills. Their conversation quieted when Rebecca entered, followed by Thomas. She took a seat at the far end of the table, noting the empty chair beside her where Jackson had sat the previous evening. "Coffee, Miss Harlow?" Mildred appeared at her elbow with a steaming pot. "And I've got flapjacks with maple syrup. Best remedy for a long journey ahead." "Thank you." Rebecca smiled gratefully at the older woman who had shown her more kindness in one evening than many had in years. "Mr. Whitaker?" Mildred's tone cooled noticeably as she addressed Thomas. "Will you be joining us?" "No, thank you." His reply was clipped. "I've already had breakfast." "Of course you have," Mildred muttered, pouring Rebecca's coffee before retreating to the kitchen. Rebecca ate quietly, aware of Thomas's impatient presence behind her. The flapjacks were indeed excellent, light and fluffy, with a rich maple flavor that spoke of local production. Another small pleasure of Timberline she would miss. The clock on the mantel showed 7:45 when Rebecca finally stood, gathering her belongings. The stage would be leaving soon. "Ready, Miss Harlow?" Thomas moved toward the door, clearly eager to complete this uncomfortable duty. Outside, the morning was crisp and clear, promising a beautiful autumn day. Timberline was already bustling with activity. Shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks, loggers gathering at the mill yard, children racing toward the small schoolhouse at the end of the street. They walked in uncomfortable silence, Rebecca matching her naturally long stride to Thomas's more hurried pace. At the stage office, a sturdy Concorde coach stood waiting, the driver securing luggage to the roof rack. "Your ticket, as promised." Thomas handed her an envelope. "The stage will connect with the Portland-bound train at Fort Collins." "Thank you," Rebecca said simply, accepting the envelope. Despite everything, she couldn't quite bring herself to be rude. Her mother's lessons in deportment ran too deep. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. "I do wish you a safe journey, Miss Harlow, and I hope you understand that this is for the best. A partnership requires compatibility." Before Rebecca could respond, a deep voice called from down the street. "Miss Harlow, wait!" Jackson Reed approached with long strides, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. He nodded curtly to Thomas before turning his full attention to Rebecca. "I was afraid I'd missed you," he said, slightly breathless. "I wanted to give you this before you left." Rebecca accepted the package, surprised by its weight. "Mr. Reed, you shouldn't have—" "Open it," he urged, his expression earnest. "Please." With careful fingers, Rebecca unwrapped the paper to reveal a small, exquisitely carved wooden box. The lid featured an intricate relief of Douglas firs against a mountain backdrop, the craftsmanship remarkable in its detail. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingertips over the polished surface. "Open the box," Jackson prompted gently. Inside lay a delicate pendant, a single perfect pine cone, no larger than her thumbnail, preserved somehow and suspended from a simple silver chain. "It's from a sugar pine," Jackson explained. "Hundreds of years old. The tree fell naturally last winter, and I've been saving this cone for something special." His eyes met hers with quiet intensity. "Something worthy." Thomas cleared his throat loudly. "The stage is boarding, Miss Harlow." Indeed, the driver was calling for passengers, the other travelers already climbing aboard. Jackson's expression darkened briefly before he composed himself. "Will you wear it for your journey?" Without hesitation, Rebecca removed the pendant from its box. "Would you help me?" Jackson stepped behind her, taking the delicate chain in his large, work-roughened hands. For such a big man, his touch was remarkably gentle as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck. The pendant settled just below her collarbone, warm against her skin. "There," he said softly, stepping back. "Safe travels, Miss Harlow." "Last call for the Portland stage," the driver announced. "You must go," Thomas insisted, reaching for her elbow. Rebecca looked between the two men, one who had rejected her on sight and one who had given her a piece of his beloved forest to carry with her. "No," she said quietly. Thomas blinked in confusion. "I beg your pardon." "I said no." Rebecca's voice grew stronger. "I will not be boarding that stage today." "But your ticket," Thomas sputtered. "Your arrangements have changed," Rebecca finished firmly. She turned to Jackson, whose expression had shifted from resignation to cautious hope. "Mr. Reed, does Timberline have a need for someone who can sew? Or perhaps teach literature alongside arithmetic in the schoolhouse?" A slow smile spread across Jackson's face, transforming his rugged features. "I believe Timberline could find use for many talents, Miss Harlow, especially those accompanied by courage." Thomas's face flushed with indignation. "This is highly irregular. You cannot simply—" "I believe Miss Harlow just did," Jackson interrupted, his tone pleasant but brooking no argument. "Perhaps you have business to attend to elsewhere, Whitaker." For a moment Thomas looked as though he might protest further. Then with a stiff nod to Rebecca, he turned on his heel and strode away. "Are you certain?" Jackson asked, once Thomas was out of earshot. "This isn't just to spite him?" Rebecca touched the pine cone pendant at her throat. "Quite certain. Though I'll need to find lodgings and employment rather quickly." "Mrs. Fletcher will be delighted to have you stay on," Jackson assured her. "And as for employment, perhaps we should discuss that over lunch, after you've had time to settle your thoughts." "I'd like that," Rebecca smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. The stage departed without her, dust settling in its wake as it rumbled out of Timberline. Rebecca watched it go without regret. Sometimes, she reflected, the most promising journeys were the ones that ended before they truly began. The following days unfolded with unexpected ease. Rebecca remained at the boarding house, moving from the travelers' quarters to a more spacious corner room on the second floor, with windows that captured both morning and afternoon light. Mildred insisted on a reduced rate in exchange for help. With the account books and some much-needed mending of linens, never was much good with numbers, the older woman confessed, or stitching straight seams for that matter. Word spread quickly that Rebecca was a skilled seamstress. By the end of her first week in Timberline, she had orders for 3 winter dresses, repairs for a half-dozen shirts, and an ambitious request from Harriet Preston for new curtains for the schoolhouse. "The current ones let in every draft," Harriet explained over tea in Rebecca's new room. "The children spend half the lessons shivering instead of learning their sums." Rebecca welcomed the work. Her fingers had always found peace in the rhythm of needle and thread, creating order from chaos, beauty from necessity. More importantly, it gave her purpose, a way to contribute to this community she was cautiously beginning to think of as home. Jackson called at the boarding house every other day, sometimes joining her for supper, other times simply stopping by to inquire after her comfort. He never stayed long, never presumed upon her time, but each visit deepened the connection between them. They spoke of books. He was surprisingly well read for a man who spent most of his days in the forest. They discussed the town's history, its struggles and triumphs, and gradually they shared pieces of themselves. "My father was a carpenter in Boston," Jackson told her one evening, as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching twilight settle over Timberline. "He taught me to respect the grain of wood, to work with it rather than against it. When he died, I came west looking for trees worthy of his lessons, and found them here," Rebecca finished for him. "Found more than trees," he admitted, his gaze warm upon her face. "Found purpose, community." He hesitated before adding, "possibility." Rebecca felt the weight of that word between them, rich with unspoken meaning. On Sunday, Jackson escorted her to church, his presence beside her a silent statement to the town. Heads turned as they entered the small, white clapboard building, Rebecca's height for once unremarkable, next to Jackson's towering frame. Thomas Whitaker sat near the front, with his sister, a pinch-faced woman who twisted in her pew to stare openly at them. Rebecca felt a momentary twinge of self-consciousness, but Jackson's steady presence calmed her racing heart. "Ignore them," he murmured, guiding her to a pew near the back. "Their opinions matter far less than they believe." After the service, several townspeople approached to introduce themselves properly. The banker's wife invited Rebecca to join her sewing circle. The mercantile owner mentioned he'd been looking for someone to help with inventory, and Harriet Preston introduced her to the school board chairman, who expressed interest in having Rebecca teach literature to the older students one afternoon each week. "See," Jackson said as they walked back toward the boarding house. "Timberline makes room for those who make themselves useful. Is that all it takes, being useful?" Rebecca asked, thinking of all the ways she'd tried and failed to fit in back east. "Being yourself," Jackson corrected gently. "The rest follows naturally." That afternoon, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Whitaker's sister, Agatha, appeared at the boarding house parlor with a tight smile and even tighter corset beneath her expensive dress. "Miss Harlow," she said, declining to sit when Rebecca offered. "I'll be direct. Your continued presence in Timberline is causing my brother considerable distress." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware Mr. Whitaker gave me another thought." "He is a prominent businessman," Agatha continued as if Rebecca hadn't spoken. "Your situation with him is the subject of unfortunate gossip." "My situation? Your rejection, followed by this dalliance with Jackson Reed." Agatha's lips pursed, as if she'd tasted something sour. "It reflects poorly on Thomas." Rebecca felt a flare of indignation. "With all due respect, Miss," Agatha corrected sharply. "Miss Whitaker," Rebecca amended. "Your brother rejected me the moment I stepped off the train, solely because of my height. I have since found welcome elsewhere in Timberline. How does that reflect poorly on anyone but him?" Agatha's nostrils flared slightly. "You're creating a spectacle of yourself with Reed. He's not the sort Thomas wanted associated with our family business." "I am not, nor will I ever be, part of your family business," Rebecca replied evenly. "And my friendship with Mr. Reed is no one's concern but our own." "He's trying to provoke Thomas," Agatha insisted, "using you to strike at our timber interests." Rebecca stood, using her full height to advantage for perhaps the first time in her life. "I am not being used by anyone, Miss Whitaker. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to complete before supper." Agatha left in a rustle of expensive fabric and wounded pride. Rebecca watched from the window as the woman marched down the street, back rigid with indignation. "Well done," came Mildred's voice from the doorway. "That one's needed a good setting down for years." Rebecca turned, embarrassed to have been overheard. "I should have been more diplomatic." "Diplomacy's wasted on people who've already decided not to hear you," Mildred shrugged. "Now come help me with these pies. Jackson's joining us for supper, and that man has an appetite like a bear before hibernation." Later, as they enjoyed Mildred's excellent apple pie, Rebecca related the encounter to Jackson, who listened with a deepening frown. "The Whitakers have been trying to buy out my northern timber claim for years," he explained when she finished. "Thomas wants to clear-cut the entire valley for a quick profit before moving on. I've refused every offer, and now he thinks I'm somehow part of your business strategy." Rebecca couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. "Thomas sees the world as transactions," Jackson said, his expression softening as he looked at her. "He can't imagine anyone acting from genuine feelings." The word hung between them, genuine, a quiet acknowledgement of the growing connection they both felt but had yet to name. "Will there be trouble?" Rebecca asked. "Between your business and his?" Jackson considered this. "There's a town council meeting next week. Whitaker's proposing a new agreement with the railroad, one that would give him exclusive rights to transport timber from the eastern slopes." He hesitated before adding, "It would effectively cut off my access to the main line." "Can he do that?" "Not Without council approval, Jackson replied, and not if enough people speak against it. Then we must ensure they do, Rebecca said firmly. Jackson's expression warmed. We? Yes, we, she confirmed, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Timberline is my home now, too. I have a stake in its future. That night, as Rebecca prepared for bed, she found herself standing before the small mirror in her room, really looking at herself perhaps for the first time in years. She was tall, yes, uncommonly so for a woman. But her height was simply a fact of her existence, neither good nor bad. It had shaped her experiences, her perspective, even her posture, but it did not define her worth. In Philadelphia, she had spent years trying to minimize herself, to fold her frame into smaller spaces, to avoid drawing attention to her difference. Here in Timberline, standing beside Jackson Reed, she found herself stretching to her full height, taking up the space she was meant to occupy. The pine cone pendant gleamed against her skin, a reminder of unexpected gifts and new beginnings. Rebecca touched it gently, thinking of the centuries-old tree it came from, the years of growth and resilience encoded in its simple form. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the continuing friction with the Whitakers, the town council meeting, the delicate navigation of her deepening relationship with Jackson. But tonight, in this room that was becoming truly hers, Rebecca felt something unfamiliar taking root inside her chest. Not just hope, something stronger. Belonging. The week leading up to the town council meeting passed in a flurry of activity. Rebecca found herself busier than she'd ever been in Philadelphia, her days filled with purpose and meaningful work. Word of her sewing skills had spread throughout Timberline, bringing a steady stream of customers to her small workroom at the boarding house. On Tuesday, she delivered the schoolhouse curtains, thick, practical wool in a cheerful forest green, that brightened the modest building while keeping out the autumn chill. Harriet had been delighted, the children even more so, crowding around Rebecca with curious eyes and endless questions. "Are you really as tall as Mr. Reed?" asked a freckle-faced boy of about 8. "Not quite," Rebecca smiled, "but close enough. My pa says you were supposed to marry Mr. Whitaker, but he thought you were too tall," a little girl with braids announced, with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Is that true?" Rebecca felt the room grow quiet, even Harriet watching uncertainty from her desk. After a moment's consideration, Rebecca knelt to meet the child at eye level. "Sometimes people have ideas about how things should be," she explained gently. "Mr. Whitaker had an idea about the kind of wife he wanted. I wasn't that kind of wife, and that's perfectly all right. I think you're just right," the girl declared firmly, "tall enough to reach the top shelves." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, and Rebecca felt a rush of affection for these children who saw her height as an advantage rather than a flaw. That afternoon, Jackson arrived at the boarding house with an unexpected proposal. "My foreman's wife is expecting their 3rd child," he explained, as they walked along the pine-shaded path that had become their favorite route. "She's been mending the crew's work clothes, but she's confined to bed now. The men are starting to look rather ragged." "Are you asking me to mend for your logging crew?" Rebecca asked, intrigued by the prospect. "I'm suggesting a business arrangement," Jackson clarified. "You'd handle repairs, replacements when necessary, perhaps even some new garments for the winter. Proper compensation, of course." Rebecca considered this. "How many men?" 28 at present," Jackson replied. "Hard workers, but harder still on their clothes." "That's a significant undertaking," she mused, mentally calculating the hours of work involved. Too much. There was no challenge in his question, only genuine concern. "Not at all," Rebecca decided. "But I'll need supplies, heavy-duty thread, waxed canvas, sturdy wool, and a schedule for deliveries and pickups." Jackson grinned, the expression transforming his serious face. "I knew you'd approach this practically. I've already spoken with Peterson at the Mercantile. He'll extend credit for whatever materials you require, billed to the company account." "You were that certain I'd agree?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow, trying to appear stern despite the smile tugging at her lips. "Hopeful," he corrected, his eyes warming as they met hers. "Not certain." They paused at the edge of town, where the forest began its steady climb toward the mountains. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy, dappling the needle-strewn path with gold. "There's something else," Jackson said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "About tomorrow's council meeting." Rebecca waited, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Thomas has been gathering support all week. He promised the saloon owner exclusive rights to supply the railroad workers. He's told the general store that railroad contracts will double their business." Jackson sighed heavily. "He's persuasive. When money's involved, and what of your side? Surely sustainable harvesting benefits the town long-term." "Long-term doesn't fill pockets today," Jackson replied. "I need to make a compelling case tomorrow night. Show them what Whitaker's plan would really mean for Timberline." Rebecca touched his arm gently. "You will. The truth has its own power." "Truth needs a voice," Jackson said, covering her hand with his own. "Which is why I hoped you might speak as well." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "Me? I've only been in Timberline for days. What weight would my words carry?" "You have a unique perspective," Jackson insisted. "You've seen similar towns boom and bust with the railroads back east, and—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You know Thomas Whitaker's character firsthand. You want me to speak against the man who rejected me?" Rebecca withdrew, her hand suddenly uneasy. "Wouldn't that seem like bitter retaliation?" "I want you to speak for Timberline's future," Jackson corrected gently. "Your experience with Whitaker is relevant only as it reflects his approach to all things. Quick judgment, prioritizing appearance over substance." Rebecca considered this. As they resumed walking, the council meeting would be her first real public appearance since the awkward scene at the train station. Some townspeople had begun to accept her, but others still viewed her with curiosity or suspicion. Would speaking out mark her permanently as an outsider, or establish her as someone committed to Timberline's well-being? "I'll think about it," she finally said as they reached the boarding house steps. Jackson nodded, accepting her uncertainty. "That's all I ask." That evening, Rebecca sat in her room, needle flashing through the heavy canvas of a logger's jacket, her mind still turning. Over Jackson's request, a soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, setting aside her work. Mildred appeared, carrying a steaming cup of tea. "Thought you might need this. You've been frowning at that jacket for an hour." Rebecca accepted the cup gratefully. "Am I that transparent?" "Only to those paying attention," Mildred replied, settling into the room's single armchair. "Jackson asked you to speak tomorrow, didn't he?" "How did you know?" The older woman snorted softly. "Been running this boarding house for 30 years. Not much happens in Timberline I don't hear about." She fixed Rebecca with a keen gaze. "You're worried about making waves." It wasn't a question, but Rebecca nodded anyway. "I've only just begun to find my place here. Speaking against Thomas Whitaker could jeopardize that. Or cement it," Mildred countered. "Depends on which Timberline you want to belong to, Whitaker's version or Jackson's." "Is it really so divided?" Mildred considered this, her weathered, and smoothing her apron. "Towns are like families, Miss Harlow. They have their disagreements, their difficult members, their different visions of the future. But in the end, they survive by remembering what binds them together. And what binds Timberline? The forest," Mildred said simply. "The trees that provide our living, shelter our homes, mark our seasons." She rose with a slight groan. "Joints, protesting the movement. Sleep on it. The right words will come or they won't. Either way, you'll still have a place here." After Mildred left, Rebecca moved to the window, looking out at the town nestled among the towering pines. In just over a week, she'd begun to feel a connection to this place, to its rhythm, its people, its quiet dignity. The thought of it being transformed by hasty development, the ancient trees sacrificed for quick profit, stirred something protective inside her. Perhaps she did have something to say after all. The town hall was filled to capacity the following evening, the air thick with pipe smoke and tension. Rebecca sat near the back, dressed in her best navy blue dress, her hair arranged in a simple but elegant knot. Jackson had saved her a seat, his large frame providing a barrier between her and the curious stares of those still unaccustomed to her presence. At the front of the room, Mayor Davis called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. A heavy-set man with an impressive mustache, he commanded respect without intimidation, a quality Rebecca found herself admiring. First item of business, he announced, Mr. Thomas Whitaker's proposal regarding railroad transportation agreements. Thomas rose from his seat in the front row, immaculately dressed in a suit that suggested Eastern tailoring. His sister Agatha sat beside him, her expression smug as she surveyed the room. "Thank you, Mayor Davis. Esteemed council members, citizens of Timberline," Thomas began, his voice projecting confident authority. "What I propose tonight is nothing less than the key to Timberline's future prosperity." For the next 15 minutes, he outlined his plan with persuasive eloquence, an exclusive agreement with the Western and Pacific Railroad that would bring a spur line directly to Timberline's Eastern Valley, allowing for increased timber shipments, new jobs, and economic growth. "Progress waits for no one," he concluded, his gaze sweeping the room. "We can embrace this opportunity or watch it go to Millerville or Fort Collins. The choice is ours." A smattering of applause followed, notably from the saloon owner and several merchants. Mayor Davis nodded thoughtfully before speaking. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Now I understand Mr. Reed wishes to present an alternative perspective." Jackson stood, his height drawing all eyes. Unlike Thomas, he wore no suit, just clean work clothes, practical but dignified, much like the man himself. "Mayor Davis, council members, neighbors," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. "Mr. Whitaker speaks of progress, but we must ask, progress toward what, and at what cost?" With methodical precision, Jackson outlined the environmental impact of Whitaker's plan, the clear-cutting of old-growth forest, the erosion that would follow, the long-term depletion of the very resource Timberline depended upon. "What Mr. Whitaker proposes isn't sustainable," Jackson emphasized, unrolling a hand-drawn map on the council table. "This isn't about resisting change. It's about ensuring Timberline still exists for our children and grandchildren." He presented his alternative, a modified agreement that would utilize existing rail lines with strategically placed loading stations, allowing for increased shipments without devastating the Eastern Valley. "We can have growth without destruction," Jackson concluded. "We can have profit without sacrifice. Timberline deserves both." The room remained silent when he finished, the weight of 2 competing visions hanging in the air. Mayor Davis cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. Before the council deliberates, are there citizens who wish to speak on this matter?" Rebecca felt her heart quicken. Jackson glanced at her, his expression not pressuring but supportive, whatever her decision. Before she could second-guess herself, she rose to her full height. "I would like to speak, Mayor Davis." A murmur rippled through the crowd. At the front of the room, Thomas Whitaker's expression darkened while Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The mayor nodded encouragingly. "Please come forward, Miss Harlow." Rebecca made her way to the front, acutely aware of every eye following her progress. She took a deep breath, centering herself before turning to face the assembled townspeople. "My name is Rebecca Harlow. Many Of you know me as the woman who arrived on the westbound train to marry Thomas Whitaker, only to be rejected because of my height. She stated this plainly, without bitterness or self-pity. Others know me as the new seamstress at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. She paused, gathering her thoughts. What few of you know is that before coming west, I lived in 3 different railroad towns in Pennsylvania. I watched Chester Creek transform from a thriving timber community to a ghost town in less than 5 years after the railroad came through. Rebecca described what she'd witnessed. The initial prosperity, followed by rapid deforestation, soil erosion that contaminated the water supply, and finally the railroad's departure once the timber was exhausted, leaving behind an economically devastated community. Clear-cutting doesn't just destroy trees, she continued. It destroys futures. The railroad doesn't care about timberline. It cares about timber, and once that's gone, so is their interest in this town. She turned slightly to address the council. Directly, I came to Timberline seeking a fresh start, a place to belong. In just over a week, I've found work, friendship, and community here. I've seen the dignity of labor and the profound respect many of you have for the forest that sustains you. Her gaze swept the room, connecting with various faces. Harriet, Preston, the mercantile owner, even Mildred, who had slipped in at the back of the hall. Mr. Reed's proposal offers balance, economic opportunity alongside environmental stewardship. It acknowledges that Timberline's prosperity can't be separated from the forest's health. She straightened her shoulders. I may be new here, but I hope to call this place home for many years to come. I want it to remain the strong, proud community I'm coming to love, not another abandoned railroad town. When Rebecca returned to her seat, the hall erupted in discussion, dozens of conversations overlapping as neighbors debated the merits of both proposals. Jackson's hand found hers, squeezing gently in silent support. You were magnificent, he whispered. Mayor Davis called for order, then invited further comment. Several citizens rose to speak, some supporting Whitaker's vision of rapid development, others advocating for Reed's more measured approach. Finally, as the clock neared 10, the mayor called for the council vote. The 5 members conferred briefly before delivering their decision. By a vote of 3-2, Mayor Davis announced, the council has decided to pursue Mr. Reed's proposal with the condition that quarterly progress reports be submitted regarding timber harvests and shipment volumes. A cheer went up from Jackson's supporters, while Thomas Whitaker rose abruptly, his face flushed with anger. He gathered his papers without a word, Agatha following in his wake as they exited the hall. Outside, the night air had turned crisp, stars appearing in brilliant clusters above the pine-darkened horizon. Citizens lingered on the town hall steps, continuing their discussions in smaller groups. Several approached Rebecca to shake her hand or offer thanks for her perspective. You've made quite an impression, Jackson observed as they finally made their way toward the boarding house. Especially for someone worried about her place here. Rebecca smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Perhaps I needed to find my voice as much as my place. It's a good voice, he said simply, clear and true. They walked in companionable silence, the events of the evening settling around them. At the boarding house gate, Jackson paused, his expression turning serious. Whitaker won't take this defeat lightly, he warned. He's not used to being opposed, much less bested. What do you think he'll do? Jackson shook his head. No, nothing immediately. He's too shrewd for that, but he'll look for another angle, another approach. Then we'll face that when it comes, Rebecca said with more confidence than she entirely felt. Together. The word hung. Between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. Jackson's eyes softened as he looked down at her. Together, he agreed quietly. He hesitated, then reached out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers gentle against her cheek. I should let you rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. "Good night, Jackson," she said softly. "Good night, Rebecca." She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the gas-lit street. Only when he turned the corner did she enter the boarding house, where Mildred waited in the parlor with tea and a knowing smile. "Well?" the older woman prompted. The council approved Jackson's proposal," Rebecca confirmed, accepting the offered cup. "I meant the other matter," Mildred clarified, her eyes twinkling. "The one that has you looking like that." Rebecca felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "There is no other matter, not yet." Mildred hummed skeptically. "If you say so." Later, preparing for bed in her quiet room, Rebecca found herself replaying the moment of Jackson's gentle touch, the way his eyes had held hers with such quiet intensity. She was not naive. At 28, she understood the gradual unfolding of attraction, the cautious dance of two people moving toward something deeper. What surprised her was not the feeling itself, but its ease. With Jackson, she never felt the need to diminish herself, to apologize for the space she occupied. In his presence, her height seemed not a liability, but a complement to his own stature, as natural as the varying heights of trees in the same forest. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind too full of the day's events, the council meeting, her unexpected speech, Thomas Whitaker's barely concealed fury, and most of all, Jackson's steadfast presence through it all. Outside her window, an owl called into the darkness, its voice echoing among the pines. Rebecca listened to its lonely, beautiful cry, until finally she drifted into dreams, filled with tall trees and a taller man with gentle hands and eyes the color of the summer sky. October gave way to November, painting timberline in shades of amber and russet before the first snows arrived. Rebecca found herself busier than ever, her days filled with sewing projects for both townspeople and Jackson's logging crew. The initial trickle of work had become a steady stream, enough that she'd had to purchase a second sewing machine, a sturdy Singer that Mildred helped her set up in what was now officially Rebecca's workroom at the boarding house. "Never seen fingers fly so fast," Mildred remarked one afternoon, watching Rebecca finish the hem on a heavy winter coat. "You've got a gift." "Practice," Rebecca corrected, though she couldn't deny the pleasure she took in creating functional, well-crafted garments. "My mother insisted all her daughters master the needle. Lucky for timberline she did," Mildred replied. "The men up at Reed's camp haven't looked this presentable in years." Indeed, Jackson's logging crew had become her most loyal customers. Twice a week, his foreman would arrive with a bundle of torn work clothes and depart with neatly mended garments. The arrangement had expanded beyond simple repairs to include custom-made canvas aprons, reinforced gloves, and winter gear designed specifically for the rigors of forest work. Jackson himself continued his regular visits, sometimes bringing small gifts, pine cones, interesting stones, once a jar of wild huckleberry preserves made by his cook. These offerings were presented without ceremony, but with a quiet intentionality that spoke volumes. Each one found a place in Rebecca's room, touchstones of their growing connection. Their conversations deepened as the weeks passed, ranging from childhood memories to philosophical debates about progress versus preservation. Rebecca found in Jackson not just attraction, but intellectual compatibility, a mind as sturdy and thoughtful as his physical presence. The town, too, was gradually accepting her. The states had lessened, the whispers mostly faded. Harriet Preston had become a true friend, stopping by regularly to share school news and town gossip. Rebecca had even been invited to join the Timberline Ladies' Aid Society, a significant step toward full community acceptance. Thomas and Agatha Whitaker, however, remained coldly distant. Though their paths crossed occasionally on timberlines, Main Street, the siblings limited their acknowledgement to curt nods. Their public defeat at the council meeting had been followed by a conspicuous withdrawal from community events, an absence that few seemed to mourn. "They're planning something," Jackson confided one evening as they walked their customary path along the forest edge. Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots, the early winter sunset casting long shadows across the pristine white ground. "Thomas has been meeting with railroad officials in Portland. Agatha's been reviewing property deeds at the county office. Can they overturn the council's decision?" Rebecca asked, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Not directly," Jackson replied, "but there are always other approaches, other pressure points." Rebecca considered this, pulling her woolen scarf tighter against the chill. "You think they'll target your timber operation, or you," Jackson said quietly. "You're the unexpected variable in their equation, the one they didn't account for." Rebecca stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Me, I'm hardly a threat to their business interests." Jackson's expression was grave, his eyes reflecting concern. "You gave Timberline a different perspective. You supported me publicly, and—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Thomas is a man who doesn't forgive perceived humiliation." The weight of his warning settled around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "What should we do?" "Be vigilant," Jackson said simply, "and remember that in Timberline, you're not alone anymore." The warmth that spread through her chest at his words had nothing to do with her thick winter coat. 2 days later, Rebecca was measuring fabric for new curtains when the shop bell jangled. She looked up to find Mayor Davis filling the doorway, his expression unusually serious. "Miss Harlow," he said, removing his hat, "might I have a word?" "Of course, Mayor." Rebecca set aside her work, gesturing to the chair opposite her work table. "Is everything all right?" The mayor settled his substantial frame onto the delicate chair with careful movements. "There's been a development regarding your legal status in Timberline." "My legal status?" Rebecca echoed, puzzled. Mayor Davis looked uncomfortable. "As you know, the town charter has certain provisions for new residents. Ordinarily, they're mere formalities, but—" He cleared his throat. "Thomas Whitaker has raised a formal objection to your business operations, citing the residence requirement for commercial enterprises." Understanding dawned. "Because I haven't been here for 3 months yet." 6 months, actually," the mayor corrected. "The charter requires 6 months of established residence before operating a business without special dispensation." Rebecca's mind raced. "But I'm not running a storefront. I'm working from Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house." "Which is precisely the second objection," Mayor Davis sighed. "The boarding house isn't zoned for commercial activity beyond lodging, technically speaking." Rebecca felt a flicker of anger. "These objections come rather conveniently after I spoke against Mr. Whitaker's interests at the council meeting." "Yes, well," the mayor shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Whitaker is within his rights to raise these concerns, however timely they might appear." "What does this mean for my work?" Rebecca asked, thinking of her commitments to customers, of the income she'd come to depend upon. "The council will need to review the matter at our next meeting," Mayor Davis explained. "Until then you may continue operating, but—" His expression grew more troubled. "If the charter provisions are strictly enforced, you could be required to suspend business operations until the residence requirement is met." 4 more months, Rebecca calculated aloud. 4 months without income, without the work that had given her purpose and place in this community. The mayor nodded solemnly. "I wanted to inform you personally. The official notice will be delivered tomorrow." After he left, Rebecca sat motionless at her work table, mind churning with implications. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a calculated move to undermine her position in Timberline. Without her business, her reason for staying became more tenuous. Without income, her independence would be threatened, exactly as Jackson had warned. The Whitakers were striking back, and they'd found her vulnerability. When Mildred returned from the market, Rebecca shared the mayor's news. Ridiculous bureaucratic nonsense, the older woman declared, setting down her purchases with more force than necessary. That charter provision hasn't been enforced since Judge Patterson caught Floyd Miller selling moonshine out of his barn in '79. Nevertheless, it exists, Rebecca said, and the Whitakers intend to use it against me. Mildred's eyes narrowed shrewdly. Have you told Jackson? Not yet. You should. That man has influence with the council. Mildred began unpacking her market basket with efficient movements. And he cares for you a great deal more than he's admitted out loud. Rebecca felt warmth rise to her cheeks. We're friends, Mildred. The older woman snorted softly. If you say so, dear. Rebecca sent word to Jackson that evening, a brief note explaining the situation. His response came before nightfall, not in writing but in person, his tall frame appearing at the boarding house door just as supper concluded. Walk with me? He asked, his expression grave beneath his snow-dusted hat. Outside, the night was clear and bitterly cold, stars shimmering like ice crystals in the black sky. They walked in silence until they reached the edge of town, their usual spot where forest met settlement. This is my fault, Jackson said finally. Whitaker's targeting you to get at me. It's not your fault, Rebecca countered firmly. I made my own choices. I spoke at that meeting because I believed in what I was saying. Jackson's expression softened, pride momentarily displacing concern. You were magnificent, but now you're paying the price for standing with me. With Timberline, she corrected, gently. I stood with this town's future. He reached for her hand, large fingers enveloping hers despite their thick gloves. We'll fight this. The council can grant exceptions to the charter provisions. We just need to make a compelling case. Rebecca squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. And if we can't? If the Whitakers succeed? Jackson was silent for a long moment, his profile strong against the starlit sky. Then we find another solution, he said finally. Together. The word carried even more weight than before. Hanging. Between them, like a promise neither was quite ready to articulate, news of Rebecca's predicament spread quickly through Timberline's gossip channels. By morning, Harriet Preston arrived at the boarding house with a petition already gathering signatures. The school board members signed first, she announced triumphantly, spreading the document on Rebecca's work table. Then Reverend Tompkins and Dr. Wallace, even Peterson from the Mercantile, though he was nervous about crossing Thomas. Rebecca scanned the growing list of signatures with mounting emotion. Names she recognized, faces that had become familiar over the past weeks, all declaring their support for her exception to the residence requirement. I don't know what to say, she managed, blinking back unexpected tears. Say you'll keep making those magnificent wool scarves for winter, Harriet grinned. Half the children in my school are wearing them now. Throughout the day, townspeople stopped by, some to sign Harriet's petition, others simply to offer encouragement. Mrs. Wallace, the doctor's wife, brought fresh baked bread. Mr. Peterson sent a bolt of fine wool fabric on account. Even the taciturn blacksmith, a man of famously few words, delivered a specially crafted needle case with compartments sized perfectly for Rebecca's various implements. Towns rallying behind you, Mildred observed that evening as they sorted through the day's gifts. Whitakers miscalculated. Rebecca nodded, touched by the outpouring of support, yet still anxious about the council's upcoming decision. Character was important in a small town, but so were laws and established procedures. If the charter was clear, even goodwill might not overcome its provisions. The night before the council meeting, a heavy snow began falling, thick flakes swirling from a pewter sky. Rebecca worked late, finishing orders that had come in before the mayor's warning. The steady rhythm of her sewing machine provided comfort, a counterpoint to the uncertainty swirling in her mind. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Mildred had already retired, so Rebecca set aside her work and went to answer. Jackson stood on the porch, snow collecting on his broad shoulders, his expression unusually intense. "I need to show you something," he said without preamble. "Can you come now?" "Now." Rebecca glanced at the swirling snow beyond the porch. "It's nearly 9, and the storm—" "Please," he interrupted, his voice carrying an urgency she'd never heard before. "It's important." Curiosity overcame caution. "Let me get my coat." Outside, the snow had transformed Timberline into a different world, silent, soft-edged, ethereal in the diffuse light of covered street lamps. Jackson led her through town toward the northern road, the one that connected to his logging camp. "Where are we going?" Rebecca asked, her boots crunching through fresh powder. "Not far," Jackson promised, offering his arm for stability on the increasingly slippery path. They turned onto a narrower trail that Rebecca hadn't noticed before, winding upward through dense pines. The climb was steep but short, ending at a small clearing that overlooked Timberline. Below them, the town's lights glimmered through the falling snow like stars fallen to earth. In the center of the clearing stood the frame of a house, just the skeleton, supporting beams and roof trusses rising from a sturdy foundation, dusted with fresh snow that sparkled in the moonlight that occasionally broke through the clouds. "What is this place?" Rebecca asked, turning to Jackson with questioning eyes. "My home," he replied simply. "Or it will be. I've been building it since summer." Rebecca moved closer to the structure, noticing details in the gloom. Extra tall, Dr. frames, high ceilings, windows positioned to capture the valley view. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship evident even in this early stage. "But why show me now, in a snowstorm?" Jackson stepped forward. Snow, crunching beneath his heavy boots. "Because tomorrow the council will decide your fate in Timberline, and before that happens, I need you to know that whatever they decide, you have a place here." Rebecca's heart quickened. "Jackson, I've been building this house since July." He continued, moving closer until she could see his eyes, serious and intent. 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, a sitting room with windows facing east to catch the sunrise. Every doorway is 7 feet tall. Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. "You designed it for someone tall." "I designed it for someone I hadn't met yet," he corrected softly. "Someone I hoped might exist somewhere in this world." Rebecca felt breathless, and not from the climb or the cold. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jackson took a deep breath, steam clouding around his face in the freezing air. "Because I need you to understand what you mean to this town. To me." He gestured toward the house frame. "I started building this before you arrived, but since the moment I saw you standing by that fallen log at the edge of the forest, I've been building it for you." Snow continued to fall around them, coating their shoulders, melting on their flushed cheeks. Rebecca struggled to find words equal to the moment. "I don't want you to answer now," Jackson said, reading her hesitation correctly. "It's too soon, I know that. But tomorrow, when you face the council, I want you to know that your place in Timberline doesn't depend on their decision." "Because of this house?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because of us," Jackson replied simply. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and cradled her face in his gloved hands. "If you decide to stay in Timberline, if you decide to stay with me, we'll build something stronger than any charter provision or business regulation." Rebecca leaned into his touch, her heart full. "I've been standing tall my whole life," she said softly. "But until I came here, until I met you, I never really stood proud." Jackson's smile transformed his face, melting years of solitude in an instant. You are the most magnificent woman I've ever known." Snowflakes caught in his beard, on his eyelashes, in the dark waves of his hair. Rebecca had never seen anything more beautiful than this man, this moment, this promise of a future neither of them had dared imagine. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, Jackson leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Rebecca responded. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to bend down or adjust her posture. Their bodies aligned perfectly, as if designed for this very purpose. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together." "Together," Rebecca agreed, the word no longer tentative but solid, substantial, a foundation as strong as the one beneath the house that surrounded them. Hand in hand, they walked back toward town, the falling snow erasing their footprints behind them. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, the council meeting, the Whitakers' opposition, the legal hurdles still to overcome. But tonight, in the quiet magic of fresh snow and new beginnings, Rebecca felt a certainty that had eluded her all her life. She belonged here, in this town among the towering pines. She belonged beside this man, who saw her height not as a flaw, but as a perfect complement to his own. For the first time since arriving in Timberline, Rebecca didn't worry about taking up too much space. Instead, she wondered if perhaps she had finally found exactly the space she was meant to fill. Morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the storm having passed during the night, leaving Timberline transformed under a pristine blanket of snow. Rebecca stood at her window, watching the town come to life. Shopkeepers clearing paths, children trudging to school, smoke rising from chimneys into the brilliant blue sky. Today, the council would decide her fate, or rather, the fate of her business. Though the two had become so intertwined, she could hardly separate them anymore. Her workroom represented more than income. It was tangible evidence of her place in this community, her contribution to its daily life. And after last night, after Jackson's revelation on the snowy hillside, the stakes felt even higher. She touched her lips lightly, still feeling the gentle pressure of his kiss, the absolute brightness of being held by someone who didn't make her feel too tall, too much, too anything except exactly as she should be. "You're wool-gathering," Mildred observed from the doorway, her tone knowing. "And with that look on your face, I'd wager it's not about the council meeting." Rebecca turned, unable to hide her smile. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been watching you two dance around each other for weeks." Mildred entered the room fully, carrying a breakfast tray. "So he finally spoke up, did he?" "He showed me the house he's building," Rebecca admitted, accepting the offered coffee. "With 7-foot doorways." Mildred's expression softened. "That man's been alone too long, building a house for a woman he hadn't met yet." She shook her head fondly. "Romantic fool." "He's not a fool," Rebecca protested gently. "All men in love are fools," Mildred countered with the wisdom of years. "The good ones are fools who build taller doorways." Rebecca laughed, some of her anxiety about the day ahead dissolving in the warmth of Mildred's understanding. They shared breakfast in companionable conversation, deliberately avoiding discussion of the council meeting until a knock at the front door signaled it was time. Jackson stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking as nervous as Rebecca felt. His face brightened when he saw her, eyes crinkling at the corners in the way that had become so dear to her. "Ready?" he asked simply. Rebecca nodded, drawing strength from his presence as they walked together toward the town hall. Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots, the morning sun casting long blue shadows across the pristine white landscape. Neither mentioned the previous night's revelations directly, but a new awareness hummed between them, making even this tense morning somehow sweeter. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived, townspeople filling benches and standing along walls. Rebecca noticed Harriet near the front, clutching the petition. Dr. Wallace and his wife sat nearby, offering encouraging nods. Even Mr. Peterson from the Mercantile was present, though he kept glancing nervously toward the door. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mayor Davis called the special session to order. The formalities were brief: minutes from the previous meeting, announcements of upcoming town business. Then, clearing his throat, the mayor addressed the matter at hand. We convene today to consider an official complaint regarding business operations in violation of Timberline's charter residency requirements, he stated, reading from a document. Specifically, the seamstress business operated by Miss Rebecca Harlow at Fletcher's boarding house, which has been in operation for approximately 6 weeks. Thomas and Agatha Whitaker sat in the front row, impeccably dressed and wearing matching expressions of smug certainty. Thomas rose when acknowledged. By the mayor, the charter is quite clear, he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. Section 23, paragraph 4 states that no commercial enterprise may be established or operated by any person resident in Timberline for fewer than 6 calendar months, except by special dispensation of the town council. He paused, adjusting his spectacles with practiced precision. Miss Harlow arrived in Timberline on October 12th. Today is November 28th. Simple arithmetic demonstrates she fails to meet the residency requirement by more than 4 months. Mayor Davis nodded gravely. The charter language is indeed as Mr. Whitaker states. Now, regarding the matter of special dispensation, if I may, Thomas interrupted smoothly, I believe precedent is relevant here. Special dispensation has historically been granted only in cases of civic necessity. The blacksmith who arrived during the fire of '82, Dr. Wallace, when the influenza epidemic required immediate medical attention. He gestured dismissively toward Rebecca. While Miss Harlow's sewing services may be convenient, they hardly constitute civic necessity. Timberline managed quite adequately before her arrival. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not all of it friendly toward Thomas. Mayor Davis tapped his gavel lightly. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Now, I understand Miss Harlow wishes to address the council. Rebecca rose, grateful for Jackson's reassuring presence beside her. She had prepared remarks, carefully considering each word, yet standing before the assembled. As townspeople, she decided to speak from her heart instead. Mayor Davis, council members, citizens of Timberline, she began, her clear voice carrying to the farthest corners of the hall. I came to this town as a stranger, expecting to begin a new life as Thomas Whitaker's wife. When those expectations changed, I chose to stay because something about Timberline, its strength, its dignity, its community, called to me. She gestured toward her supporters scattered throughout the room. In the weeks since, I've sewn dresses for your daughters, mended shirts for your husbands, crafted curtains for your schoolhouse and aprons for your loggers. My hands have become connected to your lives through every stitch. Rebecca held up her hands, palms forward, showing the tiny calluses and needle marks of her profession. These are the hands of someone committed to Timberline, someone who has already invested in its well-being. The charter's residency requirement exists to prevent transient businesses from exploiting the town. I am not transient. I am here to stay, regardless of your decision today. She paused, allowing her gaze to move deliberately to Thomas Whitaker. Some might suggest my services aren't essential. I would argue that in a frontier town, where harsh winters isolate us and self-sufficiency matters, proper clothing isn't merely a convenience, but a necessity. Ask the mothers whose children wear my reinforced mittens in the snow. Ask Jackson Reed's loggers, whose safety depends on well-maintained gear. At the mention of Jackson's name, Thomas's expression darkened. Rebecca continued undeterred. I don't ask for special treatment because of personal connections or friendships. I ask for fair consideration based on my contribution to this community and my commitment to its future. Whether that merits special dispensation is for you to decide." She sat down to scattered applause, her heart pounding but her conscience clear. She had spoken her truth without bitterness or accusation. Harriet Preston rose next, presenting the petition with flourish. 78 signatures, Mayor Davis, more than half the adult population of Timberline, all supporting Miss Harlow's exception to the residency requirement. This announcement caused a stir, even among council members. Thomas Whitaker's expression grew increasingly thunderous as the meeting continued, especially when Jackson stood to make his statement. "Timberline faces a choice today," Jackson said, his deep voice effortlessly commanding attention. "Not just about Miss Harlow's business, but about what kind of town we want to be. Do we rigidly enforce regulations designed for a different purpose? Or do we recognize when someone has already proven their value to our community, regardless of calendar dates?" More townspeople spoke, Mrs. Wallace describing the quality of Rebecca's work, Reverend Tompkins praising her contributions to the church bazaar, even young Billy Jenkins from the logging camp explaining how her reinforced gloves had prevented a serious injury when a saw slipped. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of testimony, Mayor Davis called for the council vote. The 5 members conferred in hushed tones at the front table, while the assembly waited in tense silence. By a vote of 4-1, the mayor finally announced, the council grants special dispensation to Miss Rebecca Harlow's seamstress business, waiving the 6-month residency requirement in recognition of community need and exceptional circumstances. The hall erupted in cheers and applause. Harriet hugged Rebecca impulsively while Mildred, who had slipped in during the proceedings, dabbed suspiciously at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jackson's hand found Rebecca's, their fingers intertwining in silent celebration. Thomas and Agatha Whitaker departed without comment, their rigid posture and tight expressions speaking volumes. Rebecca watched them go, feeling not triumph but relief and a touch of sadness that their animosity ran so deep. "You did it," Jackson murmured, leaning close as townspeople gathered to offer congratulations. "We did it," Rebecca corrected softly. "All of us." Later, after the crowd dispersed and the excitement settled, Rebecca and Jackson walked together through town. Snow was already being trampled into muddy slush on the main street, but side paths remained pristine, unmarked except for occasional animal tracks. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked as they paused by their favorite spot at the forest's edge. "Now you continue building your business," Jackson replied, "without looking over your shoulder for charter violations." "And the Whitakers?" Jackson's expression grew thoughtful. "They lost today publicly. Thomas doesn't handle defeat well, but he's also pragmatic. He may decide you're not worth further effort." "You don't believe that?" Rebecca observed. "No," he admitted. "But whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Together. The word carried new meaning now, weighted with possibilities neither had fully articulated. Rebecca turned to face him directly, snow crunching beneath her boots. "About last night," she began, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "The house you're building." Jackson's expression softened, a vulnerable light entering his eyes. "I meant what I said, every word, but I don't expect—" "It's beautiful," Rebecca interrupted gently, "and so is what it represents." His hand found hers again, large fingers enveloping her own. "And what does it represent, Rebecca?" "Hope," she said simply. "The kind of hope I'd almost forgotten existed." He stepped closer, lowering his voice though no one was near. "I've lived alone for a long time, built my business, my reputation, thought that was enough." His eyes held hers, serious and intent. It wasn't. Something was missing. Something tall. Rebecca smiled, allowing the gentle tease. "Someone brave," he corrected, his expression warming. "Someone who stands her ground, who sees value in what others overlook. Someone who makes me want to build not just a house, but a home. The vulnerability in his voice, the honest emotion in his weathered face, these touched Rebecca more deeply than grand gestures or flowery declarations ever could. This man, so solid and steadfast, was offering her his heart with the same careful craftsmanship he applied to his forest and his timber. "I'm not asking for promises," Jackson continued when she remained silent. "Just possibility. The chance to see where this leads." Rebecca thought of all the paths that had brought her to this moment, the loneliness in Philadelphia, the desperate courage required to answer a stranger's advertisement, the humiliation on the train platform, and the unexpected welcome that followed. Each step, even the painful ones, had led her here, to this man who looked at her height as a gift rather than a flaw. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "To see where this leads. Together." Jackson's smile transformed, his face erasing years of solitude in an instant. He bent his head to hers, their second kiss deeper and more assured than the first, a promise neither needed words to understand. December arrived with biting winds and shorter days. Timberline, prepared for Christmas with simple decorations, pine boughs over doorways, candles in windows, a community tree in the town square. Rebecca found herself busier than ever, creating gifts and holiday finery for what seemed like half the town. Her victory at the council meeting had cemented her place in Timberline. Even those who had initially viewed her with suspicion now nodded respectfully when she passed. The Whitakers remained distant, but had made no further legal challenges, focusing instead on business matters that took them frequently to Portland. "Don't trust that quiet," Mildred warned over breakfast one morning. "Thomas Whitaker doesn't forgive easily." Rebecca nodded, taking the advice seriously while refusing to let it overshadow her happiness. "I'll be vigilant," she promised. "But I won't live in fear of him either." Her relationship with Jackson had blossomed in the weeks following the council meeting. They spent every Sunday afternoon together, sometimes walking forest paths, other times visiting his partially constructed house, where progress continued despite the winter weather. He'd hired additional men after the first heavy snowfall, determined to have the roof completed before the worst storms arrived. "You're building awful fast for a man who claims to be patient," Rebecca teased as they inspected the newly installed windows, glass panes catching the winter sunlight. "Some things are worth hurrying for," Jackson replied, his eyes warming as they rested on her face. "Though the inside will take longer, I want it done right." The house was taking shape exactly as he'd described that snowy night. Tall doorways, spacious rooms, windows positioned to frame forest views. Rebecca found herself mentally arranging furniture, imagining curtains, and planning gardens for the spring. Dangerous thoughts, perhaps, for a relationship still in its early stages, but somehow they felt right. One afternoon, as Christmas approached, Rebecca was organizing her workroom when a sharp knock sounded at the boarding house door. She heard Mildred answer, followed by unfamiliar voices, male, authoritative. Curious, she stepped into the hallway just as Mildred appeared, her expression troubled. "It's for you," the older woman said. "Sheriff Adams and a man from the county court." Rebecca's heart stuttered. "The county court?" Mildred nodded grimly. "Something about property claims." In the parlor, Sheriff Adams, a lean, uncomfortable-looking man Rebecca had met only in passing, stood beside a portly gentleman clutching official-looking papers. "Miss Harlow," the sheriff began awkwardly, "this is Mr. Phelps from the county recorder's office. He has some, documents that concern you." Mr. Phelps adjusted his spectacles importantly. "I have here a formal complaint regarding improper property transfer and residency fraud filed by Mr. Thomas Whitaker." "Residency fraud?" Rebecca repeated, bewildered. "I don't understand." The council granted my business exemption. This isn't about your business, ma'am, Mr. Phelps clarified. It's about your marriage. My... What? Rebecca stared at him in complete confusion. I'm not married. According to these documents, Mr. Phelps continued, consulting his papers, you traveled to Timberline under a marriage contract with Mr. Thomas Whitaker, which transferred certain property rights and territorial claims upon your arrival. Mr. Whitaker contends that despite the non-consummation of the marriage, those contractual obligations remain binding. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. That's absurd. We exchanged letters, yes, but there was no formal contract, no legal agreement. He rejected me the moment I arrived. Sheriff Adams shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Whitaker has produced and copies of correspondence which his attorney claims constitute a binding agreement under territorial law. He's filed for an injunction against your continued independent residence and business operations. On what grounds? Rebecca demanded, anger replacing her initial shock. Breach of contractual obligation, Mr. Phelps replied, clearly uncomfortable but determined to complete his official duty. The hearing is scheduled for December 18th at the county courthouse in Fort Collins. These papers require your acknowledgement of the complaint. With trembling fingers, Rebecca accepted the documents, scanning the dense legal language that somehow transformed her correspondence with Thomas Whitaker into a binding contract she was now accused of violating. This is outrageous, Mildred declared, reading over Rebecca's shoulder. She never signed any marriage contract. That will be for the judge to decide, ma'am, Mr. Phelps replied, edging toward the door as if eager to escape the tension in the room. I'm merely delivering the official notice. After the men departed, Rebecca sank into a chair, still clutching the papers. He's trying to force me out of Timberline, she said quietly. Or worse, force me to honor the agreement these papers claim existed. Over my dead body, Mildred muttered fiercely. We need to get word to Jackson and find a lawyer. Rebecca nodded, fighting the wave of panic threatening to overwhelm her. After everything, the council victory, her growing business, her blossoming relationship with Jackson, Thomas Whitaker had found a new angle of attack, one that struck at the very foundation of her presence in Timberline. I won't let him win, she said, straightening her shoulders. I came here for a new beginning, and I won't let him take that away. Mildred's expression softened with pride. That's the spirit, girl. Stand tall. I always do, Rebecca replied, a determined smile replacing her momentary fear. It's what I do best. News of Thomas Whitaker's legal action spread through Timberline like wildfire. By evening, Jackson arrived at the boarding house, snow dusting his shoulders and concern etched across his features. He'd been working at the northern camp when word reached him and had ridden immediately to town despite the gathering darkness and falling temperatures. Let me see the papers, he said without preamble, once Mildred had ushered him into the parlor. Where Rebecca waited, she handed him the documents, watching as his expression darkened while reading. Outside, twilight settled over Timberline, lamplight reflecting on fresh snow as townspeople hurried home for supper, unaware of the new storm brewing in their midst. This is a manipulation of territorial law, Jackson finally declared, setting the papers aside. These letters never constituted a marriage contract. Whitaker is twisting the truth. But will a judge see it that way? Rebecca asked, voicing her deepest fear. County court is in Fort Collins, where the Whitakers have connections we don't. Jackson's jaw tightened. First thing tomorrow, we speak with Judge Porter. He's retired from the bench, but he knows territorial law better than anyone. If Whitaker wants a legal battle, we'll give him one. Rebecca nodded, drawing strength from his determination. I saved all my correspondence with Thomas. Every letter, including the ones where he specifically mentioned bringing me out for a trial period before any formal arrangement. Good, Jackson replied, his eyes warming slightly. That should help. They talked late into the evening, Mildred, providing coffee and sensible advice in equal measure. The three of them pored over the legal complaint, identifying weaknesses, planning defense strategies. By the time Jackson reluctantly departed, the late hour making further discussion inappropriate, Rebecca felt better prepared to face whatever came next. At the doorway, Jackson paused, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "Thank you," Rebecca replied, meaning far more than the words could convey, "for coming so quickly." His eyes held hers with quiet intensity. "There's nowhere else I would be." Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Rebecca dressed with extra care, choosing her most formal navy dress with its high collar and tailored lines. Judge Porter had agreed to see them at 9, his curiosity apparently piqued by the urgent message Jackson had sent at first light. The judge lived in a modest house near the church, its neat appearance reflecting the ordered mind of its occupant. Inside, books lined every available wall, legal texts interspersed with volumes of history and philosophy. "Quite a hornet's nest you've stirred up," Judge Porter observed after examining the complaint. He was a slight man with penetrating eyes and a scholar's stoop, his reputation for fairness matched only by his encyclopedic knowledge of territorial statutes. "I didn't stir anything," Rebecca replied with respectful firmness. "I simply chose to stay in Timberline and make my own way, after Mr. Whitaker rejected our potential match." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "May I see these letters you mentioned?" Rebecca produced her small bundle of correspondence, carefully preserved in chronological order. Judge Porter read each one with meticulous attention, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. "Interesting," he murmured after nearly an hour of silence. "Very interesting indeed." "What do you think, Judge?" Jackson asked, the tension in his voice betraying his concern. Judge Porter removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully before responding. "Mr. Whitaker's claim hinges on an obscure provision of the 1862 Homestead Act regarding marriage, agreements and property transfer. However," he tapped one of Thomas's letters, "his own words here explicitly frame the arrangement as provisional, pending in-person assessment." Hope flickered in Rebecca's chest. "So the claim has no merit." "I wouldn't go that far," Judge Porter cautioned. "The law contains ambiguities that a clever attorney might exploit, but you have substantial counter-evidence." He replaced his spectacles, fixing Rebecca with a direct gaze. "The more pressing concern is jurisdiction and influence. Judge Hamilton, who presides in Fort Collins, is an old hunting friend of Thomas's father." Rebecca's heart sank. "So regardless of the law's actual intent, the outcome is predetermined." "Not necessarily," Judge Porter replied, "but the path would be considerably more difficult." He turned to one of his bookshelves, running a finger along leather-bound volumes before selecting one. There might be another approach entirely. For the next 2 hours, they strategized. Judge Porter's legal acumen proved invaluable as they crafted a response to Thomas's complaint, focusing not on the merits of his claim, but on its appropriate jurisdiction. Territorial courts have limited authority over personal contracts without property exchange, the judge explained. If you can demonstrate that no property actually changed hands, no dowry, no land transfer, no financial commitment, then the case becomes a simple contract dispute, which belongs in local, not county, court. And local court means Timberline, Jackson concluded, understanding Dawn. Where Mayor Davis presides, Judge Porter smiled thinly. Precisely. By noon, they had drafted a formal jurisdictional challenge, which Judge Porter offered to deliver personally to the county clerk in Fort Collins the following day. As they prepared to leave, the elderly jurist had one final piece of advice. "This moves the battlefield to more favorable terrain," he said, "but doesn't end the war. Be prepared for Mr. Whitaker to escalate once he realizes his strategy has been countered." Outside, walking through Timberline's snow-covered streets, Rebecca mulled over the judge's warning. "What do you think Thomas will do when our challenge succeeds?" Jackson's expression was grim. "Something desperate. He's invested too much in forcing you out to simply surrender." "Why?" Rebecca asked, the question that had haunted her for weeks finally surfacing. Why such determination to drive away one woman who chose to stay in Timberline? This can't all be about the council vote. Jackson was silent for several steps, snow crunching beneath their boots. "It's not about the vote," he finally said. "It's about control. Thomas has always seen Timberline as his inheritance, his domain to shape as he pleases. Any challenge to that vision, any independent voice, threatens the story he tells himself. And I'm a very visible challenge," Rebecca concluded, understanding dawning. "Not just because I opposed him publicly, but because I represent a different path for Timberline, one he doesn't control." "That," Jackson agreed, "and the fact that you chose me over him." Rebecca stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "I didn't choose you over him," she corrected gently. "He rejected me before I even knew you existed. What happened afterward was entirely separate." Jackson's expression softened. "In your mind, yes. But in Thomas's view, everything is connected, everything personal. That you found happiness after. His rejection, that you flourished rather than leaving in shame, strikes at his sense of power." "That's remarkably petty," Rebecca observed. "Most tyrannies are at heart," Jackson replied with unexpected wisdom. "Grand on the surface, petty underneath." The week that followed passed in tense anticipation. Judge Porter returned from Fort Collins with cautiously optimistic news. The jurisdictional challenge had been filed and accepted for review. A decision would come within 10 days. Meanwhile, life in Timberline continued. Rebecca's business thrived as Christmas approached, townspeople commissioning everything from children's clothes to decorative table linens. The work kept her hands busy and her mind partially distracted from the legal sword hanging over her. Future. Jackson divided his time between the logging camp, where a substantial order required attention before winter fully settled in, and his house construction, which proceeded steadily despite the cold. He visited Rebecca daily, sometimes just briefly, to share news or deliver small gifts. A book of poetry, venison steaks from a hunter's recent success, once a pair of fine sewing scissors crafted by a metalworker in Portland. "To replace your worn ones," he explained as she admired the precise steel edges. "I noticed yours needed sharpening again." It was these thoughtful gestures, even more than grand declarations, that deepened Rebecca's feelings for Jackson. He noticed details, remembered preferences, anticipated needs, all without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. 5 days before Christmas, as Rebecca was delivering a completed dress to Mrs. Wallace, an unfamiliar carriage rolled down Timberline's Main Street. Its polished black surface and matched grey horses drew attention immediately. Such luxury rarely appeared in the frontier town. By the time Rebecca emerged from the Wallace home, a small crowd had gathered outside the Timberline hotel where the carriage had stopped. Through the shifting bodies, she glimpsed Thomas and Agatha Whitaker greeting a distinguished-looking gentleman in an expensive coat. "Who is that?" she asked Harriet Preston, who had appeared at her elbow. "Judge Hamilton from Fort Collins," Harriet whispered, her expression troubled. "And that's Hiram Wheeler with him, the county's most expensive attorney." Rebecca's stomach tightened. "They're here about my case." "Seems likely," Harriet agreed. "Though why bring the judge himself to Timberline?" The answer came that evening. delivered by Sheriff Adams to the boarding house door. An official notice that Judge Hamilton would hold a special session the following morning at the town hall to resolve jurisdictional questions pertaining to the complaint of Thomas Whitaker versus Rebecca Harlow. "This isn't right," Mildred declared after reading the notice. "Judges don't make house calls for simple jurisdiction decisions." "They do when strings are being pulled," Rebecca replied, a coldness settling in her chest that had nothing to do with the December weather. Jackson arrived within the hour, having received similar notification. His expression was thunderous. "Wheeler's pulled some kind of legal maneuver to bypass normal procedure. Judge Porter is reviewing it now, but he's concerned. This special session circumvents the standard review process." "What does that mean for our strategy?" Rebecca asked. "It means we need to be prepared for anything tomorrow," Jackson replied grimly. Wheeler wouldn't have brought Hamilton to Timberline unless he was confident of the outcome. They stayed up, late again, refining arguments, reviewing territorial statutes, preparing for every contingency they could imagine. Judge Porter joined them later, bringing both legal insights and troubling news. Wheeler's built his case on an 1857 precedent involving mail-order brides and property claims, the elderly jurist explained. "It's tenuous, but Hamilton seems inclined to give it weight." "So Thomas will win," Rebecca concluded, dejection seeping into her voice. "Not necessarily," Judge Porter countered, "but we need to shift our approach. Instead of challenging jurisdiction, we should focus on the fundamental nature of the agreement itself." By midnight, they had crafted a new strategy, riskier but potentially more effective. Judge Porter would argue that no marriage contract had ever existed, using Thomas's own letters as evidence that the arrangement was explicitly provisional and mutually abandoned upon Rebecca's arrival. "It's a direct challenge to the factual basis of Whitaker's claim," the judge explained. "Rather than arguing where the case should be heard, we're arguing there is no valid case at all." It was a bold approach, but as Rebecca finally prepared for bed in the early morning hours, she couldn't quiet her anxiety. Thomas had brought a county judge to Timberline for this hearing, a virtually unprecedented move that suggested confidence in his position. "Try to sleep," Mildred urged, bringing a cup of chamomile tea to Rebecca's room. "Whatever tomorrow brings, you'll face it better with some rest." But sleep proved elusive. Rebecca lay awake, watching moonlight create patterns on her ceiling, as she pondered the strange path that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a spinster in Philadelphia, resigned to a life defined by others' perceptions of her height. Now she was fighting for her right to remain in a frontier town, building a business, finding unexpected love, and standing tall, literally and figuratively, against those who would force her into a smaller space. Whatever happened tomorrow, she realized she had already won the most important battle. She had found herself in Timberline, discovered her strength, her voice, her worth. Thomas Whitaker might take her business, might even force her to leave town, but he couldn't take that fundamental victory. Morning arrived too quickly, gray light filtering through her window as snow began falling again. Rebecca dressed in her finest attire, a forest green wool dress with subtle copper embroidery at the collar and cuffs, her own handiwork and a testament to her skill. Jackson met her at the boarding house, his tall frame impressive in his own. Best clothes, not Eastern finery like Thomas would certainly wear, but clean, well-made attire that spoke of practical dignity. "Whatever happens," he said quietly as they walked toward the town hall, "remember that Timberline is with you. I'm with you." The town hall was already crowded when they arrived, curious citizens packing benches and standing along walls to witness this unusual proceeding. At the front, Judge Hamilton sat behind a makeshift bench, his expression impassive as he surveyed the room. Beside him, Hiram Wheeler arranged papers with practiced efficiency, occasionally leaning to whisper something to Thomas, who sat nearby in smug anticipation. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Hamilton called the session to order. Wheeler rose immediately, presenting Thomas's claim with polished eloquence, painting a picture of a businessman who had, in good faith, arranged for a mail-order bride, paid for her passage west, and been summarily abandoned upon her arrival, leaving him with financial losses and contractual complications. Mr. Whittaker does not seek restitution, Wheeler concluded smoothly. He asks merely that Miss Harlow honor the initial agreement by either fulfilling the implied marriage contract or departing timberline, thereby resolving the ambiguous legal situation her continued presence represents. Judge Porter rose next, his slight frame belying the sharp mind behind his arguments. With methodical precision, he dismantled Wheeler's claims, presenting Thomas's own letters as evidence that no binding contract had ever existed. Mr. Whittaker explicitly wrote that Miss Harlow was coming for a period of acquaintance to determine compatibility, Judge Porter emphasized, reading directly from the correspondence. Furthermore, it was Mr. Whittaker who terminated this arrangement upon Miss Harlow's arrival, stating, and I quote, "I need a wife who fits the role." These are not the actions or words of a man honoring a marriage contract, but rather those of someone conducting an interview and rejecting an applicant. For nearly 2 hours, the legal battle continued, arguments and counter-arguments flowing as Judge Hamilton listened with inscrutable attention. Through it all, Rebecca sat straight-backed beside Jackson, her height, for once, an advantage as she met Thomas's occasional glares with unwavering dignity. Finally, as the clock approached 11, Judge Hamilton raised his hand for silence. "Having heard arguments from both parties," he intoned formally, "I am prepared to render a decision on this matter." The room grew utterly still, tension thickening the air. Rebecca felt Jackson's hand find hers beneath the table, a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. "The question before this court," Judge Hamilton continued, "is whether a binding marriage contract existed between Thomas Whittaker and Rebecca Harlow prior to her arrival in Timberline. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, including the correspondence between parties, I find that no such binding contract existed." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Thomas's face flushed dark red while Wheeler leaned forward, clearly surprised by the ruling. "The letters exchanged," the judge continued, "clearly establish a provisional arrangement contingent upon in-person assessment by both parties. Mr. Whittaker's own words upon Miss Harlow's arrival constitute a rejection of further courtship, thereby nullifying any implied agreement. As no property changed hands and no formal marriage contract was signed, Miss Harlow remains legally independent and free to establish residence wherever she chooses." Relief washed over Rebecca in a dizzying wave. Beside her, Jackson exhaled, slowly, his grip on her hand tightening momentarily. "Furthermore," Judge Hamilton added, his tone hardening slightly, "this court views with concern the apparent attempt to use legal mechanisms to harass a citizen who has been granted full business rights by Timberline's town council. Let the record show that any further complaints of this nature will be scrutinized for potential abuse of process." With that remarkable statement, he struck his gavel once, declaring the matter resolved. The assembled townspeople broke into spontaneous applause, standing to show their support for the outcome. Thomas Whittaker rose abruptly, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Without a word to Wheeler or his sister, he strode from the hall, the crowd parting silently to let him pass. Agatha followed moments later, her expression equally stormy, but tempered with something that almost resembled grudging respect as her gaze briefly met Rebecca's. Outside, snow continued falling, transforming Timberline into a Christmas card scene of white-dusted buildings and pine boughs. Citizens spilled from the town hall into the winter morning, voices raised in excited discussion of the unexpected ruling. "I can't believe Hamilton ruled against Thomas," Harriet marveled, joining Rebecca and Jackson as they emerged. "Everyone knows they're old family friends." "Justice occasionally prevails, even when friendship is at stake," Judge Porter observed, appearing at Rebecca's elbow. "Though I suspect there's more to the story than we know." Only later, during the impromptu celebration at the boarding house, did they learn the truth. Mayor Davis, arriving with a bottle of his best whiskey, shared what he'd heard from the hotel proprietor. "Seems Judge Hamilton and Thomas's father had a falling out years back," he explained, accepting a glass from Mildred. "Something about a mining claim and broken promises. The judge has been waiting for an opportunity to teach the younger Whitaker a lesson about honor and contracts." "So our victory wasn't about legal merits at all?" Rebecca asked, disappointment coloring her voice. "Oh, the legal argument was sound," Judge Porter assured her. "But in matters of justice, sometimes Providence needs a little help from old grudges." As evening settled over Timberline, the celebration continued. Townspeople dropped by with food and drink, congratulations and welcoming embraces. What had begun as a legal victory had transformed into something more significant, a community's declaration that Rebecca truly belonged. Later, as the gathering quieted and guests began departing, Jackson drew Rebecca aside to the boarding house porch. Snow had stopped falling, leaving the world hushed and white beneath a canopy of brilliant stars. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small wooden box from his coat pocket, "an early Christmas gift." Rebecca accepted it curiously. The box itself was beautiful, hand-carved pine with intricate forest patterns decorating its surface. Opening it carefully, she found a simple gold ring nestled on a bed of velvet. "Jackson," she breathed, understanding immediately. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. "My father made it for her from the first gold he panned in California." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "Rebecca Harlow, I'm not offering a contract or an arrangement or a business proposition. I'm offering my heart, my future, my name, if you want them." Rebecca looked at the man before her. This tall, steady, honorable man who had never once made her feel too much or too tall or too anything except perfectly herself. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. "We've known each other for such a short time." "I've been building a house with 7-foot doorways since July," Jackson reminded her with a gentle smile. "Some things you just know, even before you can explain why." Rebecca closed her fingers around the ring, feeling its solid weight, a tangible symbol of all that had changed since she'd stepped off that train in October. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to your heart, your future, your name. Yes to all of it." Jackson's smile transformed his face, joy erasing the worry lines etched by recent days. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, his kiss carrying all the promises words couldn't adequately express. When they finally parted, Rebecca laughed softly. "What will Thomas say when he hears?" "Nothing that matters," Jackson replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "His opinion stopped being important the moment he failed to see your worth." As if summoned by his name, a carriage rattled. Down the street, the same elegant black vehicle that had brought Judge Hamilton to town. Through the window, they glimpsed Thomas and Agatha Whitaker, trunks strapped to the roof, indicating departure rather than a short journey. Leaving town, Jackson observed as the carriage continued toward the Portland Road. "I'd heard rumors he was considering relocating his business interests." "Because of the ruling?" Rebecca asked. Jackson shook his head. "Because he finally realized he can't control Timberline or its people, not anymore." They watched until the carriage disappeared into the darkness beyond town, carrying away the man who had inadvertently set Rebecca's new life in motion. There was no triumph in her heart, only a quiet gratitude for paths not taken and doors unexpectedly opened. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: wedding plans, business expansion, house completion, the continuing work of building a life together. But tonight, standing beside the man who saw her height as a perfect complement to his own, Rebecca Harlow felt something she had searched for her entire life. Not belonging, not acceptance, freedom. Freedom to stand tall, to take up space, to build. A life measured not in inches but in love, purpose, and possibility. In finding Jackson, she had not just found a man tall enough to make her feel delicate. She had found someone who made her feel exactly as she was meant to be, perfect at any height. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.